The rifle made almost no sound when it fired. Just a sharp breath of air, like wind through a canyon crack, followed by the distant clang of lead-striking steel 300 yards downrange. The Army marksmen standing in the snow at Fort Laramie had just heard their Springfield rifles boom across the valley like thunder, and now they watched in silence as this lone mountain man with his strange weapon hit targets they had missed. It was winter 1852, and what happened in the next hour would challenge everything the United States Army believed about firearms, accuracy, and the possibilities of frontier innovation. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if stories about frontier innovation and impossible achievements speak to you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's story might be even more remarkable than this one. The clearing outside Fort Laramie stretched flat and white under a gray February sky. Snow had fallen the night before, leaving everything smooth and unmarked except for the boot prints of soldiers who had been preparing the shooting course since dawn. Wooden targets stood at intervals stretching from 50 yards to 300, each one marked with circles of black paint against pale lumber. A crowd had gathered despite the cold. Soldiers in blue uniforms, traders in buckskin and wool, Lakota observers from the nearby camps, and fort civilians all stood in clusters, their breath fogging the air as they waited for the demonstration to begin. The mountain man stood apart from everyone else, checking his rifle with the careful attention of someone who understood that his reputation and possibly his safety depended on what happened next. He was in his early 30s, lean and weathered, with a beard that had been trimmed recently but not well. His clothing marked him as someone who spent most of his time far from settlements. Worn canvas coat, leather trousers reinforced at the knees, moccasins wrapped in rabbit fur for warmth. The rifle he held looked strange. The barrel was longer than standard, and there was an unusual thickness just behind the breech that gave the weapon an odd profile. Captain William Morrison stood near the firing line with 3 of his best marksmen. Morrison was 41 years old, a career officer who had served on the frontier for 16 years. He had agreed to this demonstration with considerable skepticism. The rumors coming out of the mountains for the past 2 years had seemed impossible. A rifle that fired with almost no sound but maintained accuracy at long range contradicted everything Morrison understood about firearms. Loud reports were a consequence of the explosive force needed to propel a ball with sufficient velocity and accuracy. You could reduce noise by reducing powder, but then you lost range and power. That was simply how physics worked. The mountain man had arrived at the fort 5 days earlier with an unusual request. He wanted to demonstrate his rifle against the Army's best shooters. He was not asking for money or trying to sell anything. He simply wanted witnesses to what his weapon could do. Morrison had granted the request partly from curiosity and partly because he thought it would be entertaining to watch frontier superstition meet military reality. Now, watching the man prepare his rifle with such methodical care, Morrison felt the first small stirrings of uncertainty. 4 years earlier, in the autumn of 1848, Daniel Crow had been hunting elk in the high country of what would later become Wyoming Territory. He had established a temporary camp near a series of meadows where elk gathered during their seasonal migration. The location was perfect. Water, cover, and game trails that funneled animals through natural corridors where a careful hunter could position himself for clean shots. Daniel had been trapping and hunting in the Rockies for 6 years by that point, and he understood the rhythms of the wilderness as well as any man could. He had spotted a bull elk at dawn, a massive animal with a rack that would have been worth significant money to Eastern buyers who paid premium prices for impressive antlers. The shot was straightforward, maybe 80 yards across a meadow, with the animal standing broadside and unaware. Daniel had fired his Hawken rifle, a .50 caliber percussion weapon that was considered among the finest hunting rifles available. The ball took the elk perfectly, dropping it where it stood. The sound of the shot, however, changed everything. The report echoed across the valley like a cannon blast, bouncing off rock faces and rolling through the timber in waves that seemed to last forever. Daniel watched as every living thing within a mile radius reacted to that sound. Deer that had been feeding in nearby meadows bolted into the forest. A small herd of elk that Daniel had not even seen crashed through distant timber in panic. Birds erupted from trees in clouds of wings and alarm calls. Even after the echoes faded, the valley remained disturbed. Nothing moved in the open. Every animal had gone to ground or fled entirely. Daniel spent the rest of that day processing the elk and packing the meat back to his camp. But over the following week, the consequences of that single shot became devastatingly clear. The hunting grounds that had been so productive were now essentially empty. Animals that had been using established trails were now avoiding the area entirely, or moving through only at night with extreme caution. Daniel saw tracks and sign, but the actual animals remained invisible and unapproachable. Game had not left the region entirely, but their behavior had changed in ways that made hunting nearly impossible. This was not a new problem. Every hunter on the frontier understood that gunshots disturbed game. The usual solution was to move to new hunting grounds after taking an animal or two from any given area. But Daniel had been hunting these mountains long enough to recognize a larger pattern. As more trappers and hunters worked the Rockies, there were fewer and fewer places where game had not been spooked by recent gunfire. Areas that had once been productive were becoming barren, not because animals were being killed in unsustainable numbers, but because they were learning to avoid anywhere that smelled of humans or echoed with the sound of rifles. Daniel sat by his fire that night and considered the problem. Hunting required getting close enough for accurate shots, but the very act of shooting made future hunting harder. Daniel began experimenting the following week. His first assumption was that reducing the powder charge would reduce the noise. He spent an afternoon testing different amounts of black powder, measuring carefully and recording the results. A full charge in his Hawken used 90 grains of powder and produced that thunderous report he was trying to eliminate. He tried 80 grains, then 70, then 60. Each reduction did decrease the sound slightly, but the trade-off was unacceptable. Below 70 grains, the rifle lost effective range and hitting power. A wounded animal that escaped to die slowly in the forest was worse than no shot at all. He tried different types of wadding between the powder and ball, thinking perhaps he could muffle the explosion somehow. He used extra cloth patches, leather scraps, even moss packed tightly. Nothing made a significant difference. The problem was fundamental. Black powder burned explosively, creating massive amounts of hot gas that escaped the barrel with violent force. That escaping gas was what created the noise. You could not eliminate the sound without fundamentally changing how the weapon worked. Daniel experimented with barrel length. He had heard theories that longer barrels gave powder more time to burn completely, potentially reducing the blast at the muzzle. He bought a rifle barrel blank from a trader passing through the region and spent 2 weeks working with basic tools to create a test barrel that was 8 inches longer than standard. The result was marginal at best. The rifle was awkward to handle, the additional length made it difficult to maneuver in timber, and the noise reduction was barely noticeable. He tried wrapping the barrel in leather, then in layers of wool and canvas, thinking perhaps he could insulate the sound somehow. This accomplished nothing except making the rifle even more unwieldy and causing the barrel to overheat after multiple shots. The wrapping material caught fire during one test, forcing Daniel to tear it off quickly and stamp out the smoldering fabric in the snow. Winter was approaching, and Daniel was running out of time to secure enough meat for the coming months. His experiments had consumed weeks of hunting season, and he had little to show for it, except a collection of modified rifles that did not work properly and a growing sense of frustration. Other trappers he encountered were having similar problems, with game becoming increasingly wary and difficult to approach. Some were giving up and leaving the mountains entirely. Others were pushing into more remote areas where game had not yet learned to fear gunfire, but those areas were becoming fewer and harder to reach. Daniel sat in his cabin one evening in late November, cleaning his rifle and considering his options. He could abandon the mountains and try to find work elsewhere. He could continue hunting the traditional way and accept the diminishing returns, or he could keep searching for a solution that might not exist. Outside, snow began to fall, heavy and steady, muffling every sound in the forest. The snow fell for 3 days without stopping. Daniel remained in his cabin, watching through the single window as the world outside disappeared under white silence. On the second day, he noticed something unusual. A branch snapped somewhere in the timber, loud, enough that he would normally have heard it clearly from 100 yards away. But the sound was strangely muted, arriving at his ears soft and indistinct. The falling snow was absorbing sound in ways that seemed almost impossible. He stepped outside on the third morning when the storm finally cleared. The snow was nearly 3 feet deep, and the silence was profound. Daniel clapped his hands together sharply. The sound was flat and dead, completely lacking the sharp crack he expected. He shouted. His voice seemed to fall into the snow and vanish. He fired his rifle into the air, and while the report was still loud, it was noticeably quieter than normal. The snow in the air and piled on every surface was acting like a blanket, trapping and absorbing sound waves before they could travel and echo. Daniel stood in the clearing, holding his rifle and thinking. Snow absorbed sound by providing millions of soft surfaces that dampened vibrations. Could something similar be built into a rifle? Not snow, obviously, but some kind of chamber or system that would capture the explosive gas and disperse it gradually rather than letting it all blast out the muzzle at once? The idea seemed absurd at first. How could you trap gas inside a weapon that needed to expel a projectile? But the more he considered it, the more he realized it might be possible. The key would be creating a space where gas could expand and slow down before being released. If most of the gas could be captured in a chamber and allowed to cool and disperse gradually, perhaps only a fraction of the normal blast would exit the muzzle alongside the ball. The ball itself would still travel at full velocity because it would leave the barrel before the gas expansion reached its peak. But the sound could be dramatically reduced. Daniel spent the next week sketching designs in charcoal on pieces of bark and scrap leather. He had no formal engineering training, but 6 years of maintaining and repairing his own equipment in the wilderness had given him a practical understanding of how mechanical systems worked. The design that emerged was simple in concept, but would be difficult to execute. He would need to modify the barrel itself, creating an expansion chamber just behind the muzzle. The chamber would need to be precisely sized. Too small, and it would not capture enough gas to make a difference. Too large, and it would reduce the velocity of the ball. He would also need help. The modifications required metalworking skills and tools he did not possess. There was a gunsmith at Bent's Fort, nearly 200 miles southeast. Daniel packed his gear, wrapped his rifle carefully, and prepared for the journey. It was the middle of winter, but he could not wait until spring. The journey to Bent's Fort took Daniel 19 days through snow and bitter cold. He arrived in mid-December to find the fort busy with traders waiting out the winter. The gunsmith was a German immigrant named Heinrich Weber who had been working at the fort for 8 years. Weber was in his 50s, precise and methodical, with a reputation for excellent work and a willingness to attempt difficult modifications. Daniel explained what he wanted, showing Weber his sketches and describing the concept of the expansion chamber. Weber studied the drawings for a long time before speaking. He understood what Daniel was proposing, and he could see the theory behind it. The question was whether it could be built with the tools and materials available at a frontier fort. They would need to bore out a section of barrel to create the expansion chamber, then carefully drill gas ports that would allow pressure to escape in controlled ways. The tolerances would need to be exact. Too much deviation, and the rifle might be dangerous to fire, or simply would not work. They began work in early January. Weber had a small forge and a collection of specialized tools he had brought west when he emigrated. Daniel had brought enough beaver pelts to pay for the work and for his supplies while staying at the fort. The first step was selecting the right barrel. Weber had several blanks in his workshop, and they chose one made of high-quality Swedish iron, known for its consistent grain and strength. The barrel was already rifled with 7 grooves, which would give the ball stability and accuracy. Weber heated and shaped the barrel, creating a bulge approximately 4 inches behind where the muzzle would be. This bulge would become the expansion chamber once the interior was bored out. The work was painstakingly slow. Weber insisted on checking measurements constantly, using calipers and gauges to ensure the chamber walls maintained consistent thickness. Too thin, and the chamber might rupture when fired. Too thick, and the rifle would be unnecessarily heavy. Once the expansion chamber was formed, Weber drilled a series of small ports angled backward from the chamber toward the breech. These ports would allow gas to flow into the chamber and circulate, slowing and cooling before being released. The size and angle of these ports were critical. Daniel and Weber tested different configurations, plugging ports and drilling new ones until they found a pattern that seemed optimal. The final modification was a sleeve that fit over the expansion chamber. Weber crafted this from brass, with fine mesh screens inside that would further disperse and cool the gas. The sleeve could be removed for cleaning, which was important because powder residue would accumulate inside the chamber with use. After 6 weeks of work, the rifle was complete. It looked strange, with its bulged expansion chamber and brass sleeve making it immediately distinctive from any standard weapon. Weber had also installed a percussion lock that he guaranteed would be reliable in cold and damp conditions. Now came the crucial test. They needed to fire it and see if Daniel's theory actually worked. They tested the rifle on a cold morning in late February. Weber and Daniel walked a mile from the fort to a canyon where the sound would not alarm people inside the walls. Daniel loaded the rifle carefully, using 85 grains of powder and a patched round ball. His hands were steady despite the significance of the moment. 6 weeks of work and considerable expense had led to this. If the rifle failed catastrophically, he could be injured or killed. If it simply did not work as intended, he would have wasted an entire winter. Weber stood 30 feet back, watching. Daniel raised the rifle, aimed at a target they had placed against the canyon wall, and fired. The rifle kicked normally against his shoulder. The ball struck the target dead center. But the sound was completely different from any rifle either man had ever heard. Instead of a sharp, thunderous crack, there was a heavy thump followed by a hissing sound as gas escaped through the ports and dispersed through the brass sleeve. The report was perhaps 1/3 the volume of a standard rifle, maybe less. Daniel and Weber looked at each other in stunned silence. It had worked. The expansion chamber had captured most of the explosive force and released it gradually enough to dramatically reduce the sound. Daniel fired 3 more shots, and each time the result was the same: a heavy but muted thump instead of a crack. The accuracy remained excellent. The recoil was actually slightly less than a standard rifle because the gas expansion was being managed rather than released all at once. Over the following week, Daniel tested the rifle extensively. He fired it at different ranges, in different weather conditions, and with different powder charges. The design proved consistent. The quieter report came with some trade-offs. The rifle was heavier than standard because of the expansion chamber and brass sleeve. It required more frequent cleaning because powder residue accumulated in the chamber and ports, and the effective range was slightly reduced because the ball velocity was marginally lower than a standard rifle firing the same powder charge. But for hunting, these trade-offs were acceptable. The ability to fire without spooking every animal within a mile was worth far more than an extra 20 yards of range. Daniel left Bent's Fort in early March and returned to his hunting grounds. Spring was approaching, and game would be emerging from winter cover. He spent the next month hunting with his modified rifle, and the results exceeded even his optimistic expectations. He could take an animal and remain in the area to hunt again within days rather than weeks. Other game did not flee at the sound of his shots because the sound did not carry far enough to alarm them. His success rate improved dramatically. By summer, he had accumulated more pelts and meat than in any previous season. Other trappers began noticing Daniel's success. They asked questions about his strange-looking rifle. He explained the concept, but did not share specific details about how Weber had built it. Word spread gradually through the mountain man community. By the autumn of 1851, stories about Daniel Crow and his quiet rifle had reached Fort Laramie. The fort was a major hub on the Oregon Trail and served as a supply point for military operations across the northern plains and Rocky Mountain regions. Traders, trappers, and soldiers passed through constantly, bringing news and rumors from across the frontier. The tale of a mountain man with a rifle that barely made sound but could still kill at long range seemed like typical frontier exaggeration. But enough people had mentioned Daniel specifically, and enough claimed to have witnessed his hunting success firsthand, that some officers began paying attention. Captain William Morrison heard the story in November from a trader who had spent the summer in the mountains. The trader described watching Daniel take 3 elk from the same meadow over the course of a single week, something that should have been impossible given how gunfire normally spooked game. Morrison was skeptical but intrigued. The United States Army was always interested in firearms innovations. Anything that could provide tactical advantages deserved investigation. A rifle that could fire without revealing the shooter's position through sound would have obvious military applications. Morrison sent word through the network of traders and mountain men that he would like to meet this Daniel Crow and see his rifle. The message included an invitation to Fort Laramie and a promise that Daniel would be compensated for his time. Morrison expected the invitation might be ignored. Mountain men were notoriously independent and often suspicious of military authority. But 3 months later, in February of 1852, Daniel arrived at the fort. Morrison met with him in the fort's headquarters building. Daniel was reserved but not hostile, answering questions directly and showing Morrison the rifle. Morrison examined the weapon carefully, noting the expansion chamber and brass sleeve. The craftsmanship was excellent, but the design was unlike anything he had seen. Daniel explained the basic principle without revealing all the specific details of construction: gas expansion and controlled release. Simple in concept, difficult in execution. Morrison proposed a demonstration. He would assemble 3 of the fort's best marksmen. They would compete against Daniel in a shooting match with witnesses present. If Daniel's rifle performed as claimed, Morrison would write a detailed report to his superiors recommending further investigation. Daniel agreed. He had not come to Fort Laramie seeking fame or contracts. He had come because he was proud of what Heinrich Weber had built and wanted recognition for the innovation. He also knew that military interest might lead to improvements in the design or wider adoption of the concept, which could benefit hunters and trappers across the frontier. They scheduled the demonstration for 1 week later, giving Morrison time to prepare the shooting course and assemble observers. Word spread quickly through the fort and surrounding camps. By the morning of the competition, nearly 200 people had gathered to watch. Soldiers, civilians, traders, and native observers all stood in the cold, waiting to see if the rumors were true. The competition began at mid-morning with the sky overcast and the temperature well below freezing. Captain Morrison explained the rules to the assembled crowd. There would be 3 stages. First, accuracy at 50 yards against standard circular targets. Second, rapid shooting at 100 yards against multiple targets. Third, long-range precision at 300 yards against smaller targets. Each shooter would fire 5 shots per stage. Scoring would be based on accuracy, with ties broken by tightest grouping. The Army marksman went first. Sergeant Thomas Kellerman was the first shooter, a veteran of 12 years who had won the fort's shooting competition 3 years running. He fired his Springfield rifle at the 50-yard targets with methodical precision. Each shot produced the familiar thunderous crack that echoed across the valley. His grouping was excellent, all 5 shots within the innermost circle. The crowd murmured approval. Corporal James Wade went next, achieving similar results. Private First Class Robert Chen, the youngest of the 3 marksmen at 24 years old, matched his more experienced colleagues. All 3 Army shooters demonstrated exactly what Morrison had expected: professional competence and excellent accuracy. Then Daniel stepped to the firing line. The crowd grew quieter, anticipation building. He loaded his rifle with the careful movements of someone who had performed this action thousands of times. Powder measured, ball patched and seated, percussion cap placed. He raised the rifle, aimed briefly, and fired. The sound was startling in its difference. That heavy thump followed by the hiss of dispersing gas. No sharp crack, no rolling echo across the valley, just a sound like someone striking a log with a mallet, muted and directional. The ball struck center on the target. Daniel reloaded and fired again. Same quiet report, another center hit. He completed all 5 shots in less time than the Army marksman had taken because his rifle required no different loading procedure despite its unusual design. His grouping was slightly tighter than Kellerman's. The crowd stood in stunned silence for a moment before breaking into conversation. The rifle truly was as quiet as the rumors claimed. The second stage at 100 yards tested rapid shooting. The targets were man-sized silhouettes made of painted wood. The Army marksmen performed well, though the increased range showed more variation in their accuracy. Wade missed 1 target entirely when wind caught his shot. Chen's grouping spread wider under the pressure of shooting faster. But all 3 demonstrated solid competence. Daniel's performance at this range was nearly identical to the first stage. The quiet report of his rifle became familiar to the watching crowd, though no less remarkable. He hit all 5 targets, and his grouping remained tight despite the longer distance. Morrison watched with growing interest. The rifle was not just quiet, it was accurate. The two qualities combined in ways that contradicted his assumptions about firearms design. The third stage would be the real test. 300 yards in winter, wind against targets half the size of the previous ones. This was where superior equipment and skill separated from mere competence. The 300-yard targets were wooden squares painted white with black centers, each one measuring roughly 18 inches across. At that distance, they appeared small and indistinct, especially against the snow. Wind had picked up as the morning progressed, gusting unpredictably across the valley. This kind of shooting required judgment as much as accuracy. A marksman had to read wind speed and direction, estimate how much the ball would drift during flight, and adjust aim accordingly. At 300 yards, a difference of inches in aiming point could mean a complete miss. Sergeant Kellerman fired first. His initial shot missed the target entirely, the ball striking snow 3 feet to the right. He adjusted, and his second shot clipped the edge of the target. His third shot hit closer to center. His fourth and fifth shots were solid hits. Acceptable performance, but not exceptional. Corporal Wade struggled more with the distance. He managed 3 hits out of 5 shots, with 2 complete misses. Private Chen performed slightly better than Wade, achieving 4 hits, though none were centered. The difficulty was clear. Standard military rifles fired relatively light balls at high velocity. This gave them good range, but the light projectiles were more susceptible to wind drift. At 300 yards, even moderate wind could push a ball significantly off course. The Springfield rifles the Army used were excellent weapons for their intended purpose, but extreme long-range accuracy in adverse conditions was not their primary design goal. Daniel loaded his rifle and settled into position. He took longer to aim than he had at shorter ranges, clearly reading the wind and calculating his hold. When he fired, the quiet thump seemed almost anticlimactic after the thunder of the Army rifles. The ball struck the target just left of center. Good, but not perfect. He reloaded, adjusted his aim fractionally, and fired again. This shot hit dead center. His third, fourth, and fifth shots all grouped tightly around the center mark. The difference was immediately apparent to anyone who understood firearms. Daniel's rifle fired a heavier ball at slightly lower velocity. The heavier projectile was less affected by wind, maintaining a more stable flight path over long distance. The reduced velocity meant a more arched trajectory. But at 300 yards, that was manageable with proper aim adjustment. The trade-off that had seemed like a disadvantage at closer ranges became an advantage at extreme distance. Captain Morrison walked to the targets with several other officers to verify the results. The scoring was decisive. Daniel had outperformed all 3 Army marksmen at the longest range, and his overall performance across all 3 stages was superior. The crowd applauded, a genuine response to skill they had just witnessed. Daniel lowered his rifle and stood quietly, accepting the recognition, but not seeking more. Morrison returned to the firing line and extended his hand. Daniel shook it. The captain's expression was thoughtful, already considering what this demonstration meant. The quiet rifle was not just a curiosity, it was a genuinely superior design for specific applications. The question now was what would happen next. Captain Morrison invited Daniel to his office that evening. A fire burned in the stone hearth, driving back the winter cold. Morrison poured whiskey into 2 tin cups and sat across from Daniel at a simple wooden table. He spoke directly, as was his nature. The Army would be interested in Daniel's rifle design. Morrison would write a detailed report to his superiors describing what he had witnessed. There might be interest in purchasing rights to the design or commissioning Heinrich Weber to produce rifles for military testing. Was Daniel willing to discuss such possibilities? Daniel sipped the whiskey and considered his answer carefully. He explained that the rifle design belonged as much to Weber as to himself. Daniel had conceived the idea, but Weber had solved the mechanical problems that made it work. Any arrangements would need to include the gunsmith. Morrison agreed this was reasonable. Daniel then said something that surprised the captain. He was not particularly interested in selling the design to the Army. He had come to Fort Laramie to demonstrate that frontier innovation could match or exceed military engineering, not to become a supplier of weapons. If the Army wanted to pursue the concept, Weber's contact information was available through Bent's Fort. Morrison asked Daniel what he wanted then, if not military contracts or recognition. Daniel's answer was simple. He wanted people to understand that solutions to difficult problems often came from necessity and practical experience rather than formal institutions. Mountain men were frequently dismissed as ignorant or primitive by military officers and Eastern society. Yet, someone working alone in the wilderness with limited resources had developed a firearms innovation that professional armories had not conceived. That meant something, and Daniel wanted it acknowledged. Morrison wrote his report over the following week. It was thorough and honest, describing the demonstration in detail and recommending further investigation of the expansion chamber design. The report noted that while military applications might be limited due to the rifle's weight and maintenance requirements, the concept had merit for specialized roles. Scouts, sharpshooters, and advanced reconnaissance units could benefit from weapons that did not reveal their positions through sound. Daniel left Fort Laramie in early March, returning to the mountains with supplies purchased from his demonstration payment. He continued hunting and trapping for another 6 years before finally leaving the frontier in 1858. His rifle remained with him throughout those years, reliable and effective. When he eventually settled in western Oregon, he brought the weapon with him, though he rarely used it in his new life as a farmer. Heinrich Weber received inquiries from the Army, but declined to pursue large-scale production. He was a craftsman, not a manufacturer, and had no interest in running a factory. He did build several more rifles using the expansion chamber design for individual clients willing to pay premium prices. The concept influenced later firearms development, particularly in sound suppression technology that would not mature until the 20th century. Daniel Crow's impossible rifle had proven that innovation could emerge from anywhere when necessity demanded it, and skill met determination in the wilderness.